I wanted to welcome all of you. Thank you very much for coming to a very timely conversation about a topic which never stays out of the news, which is the Middle East. Our sponsor here is the Public Affairs Alliance of Iranian Americans, PAIA. I suggest you check out their website. It's one of the most prominent Iranian American organizations, which is doing great work. Our guests today, Tom Friedman and David Ignatius, it's a cliche, they need no introduction, but it really is true in their case. They're two of the most acclaimed journalists in the United States. I think what I'd just like to say about them in an introduction is that they've written two of the most seminal books about the Middle East over the last 3 decades. Tom's book, From Beirut to Jerusalem, was written 25 years ago, and if you go to Amazon right now, it's still among the top few best-selling books on the Middle East, which is quite remarkable given how much this region has evolved. And David's first book is a novel, actually, called Agents of Innocence, which was written in 1987, I believe. And to show you how prescient he was, the nonfiction version of that book was just authored this year. It came out this year, The Good Spy by Bob Ames. And a European foreign minister once told me that if he ever wants to understand what the CIA is thinking about an issue, he reads David Ignatius's novels. Yeah. So, you know, and I think the history of civilization and Iranian organization has never sponsored a discussion only about the Arab world, but we are going to start with the Arab world, just given what's happening. And I wanted to ask both of you to reflect a little bit on your careers, because when you first started 3-4 decades ago, the most notorious terrorist organization in the world was the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And then you were there at the early days of Hezbollah, the emergence of Hezbollah, which made PLO look moderate. And about a decade and a half later came Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, which made Hezbollah look moderate. And now we have this group, ISIS, which makes remarkably Al-Qaeda look moderate in comparison. And I just wanted to ask you to reflect about how we got to where we are. Is this kind of the malaise, internal malaise of the Arab world? Is this a function of U.S. policy missteps? Is it conceivable that 10 years from now we'll have a group which makes ISIS look moderate? Why don't you start off, David?
The other day, Tom and I were walking out of the White House after being at a briefing together, and we turned to each other and remembered the time in which we began covering the Middle East in the early 1980s. And I mentioned to Tom facetiously all the brilliant young men, they mostly were men, from the fine families of Lebanon, but they had friends in every Arab country, who would meet with us in Beirut and talk about their dream of a new Middle East and how they were going to create something democratic based on the rule of law. They had studied in the United States. They were extraordinary people. And I think, I'll speak for myself, it was impossible not to be seduced by that vision, to believe that there was a new modern Middle East that was being born. In fact, the Shia community in Lebanon and Iraq seemed like the leading edge of it. You know, these were the rising class, the dispossessed, who were going to, in asserting their power, inevitably would assert democratic values because that was in their interest. And I mention this because I look back on their shattered dreams and ask myself, as I know Tom often does, what happened? And I'll just begin my answer by saying the following. In the years after 1980, what happened to the world was another miracle. It wasn't the modernization of the Arab Middle East, it was globalization. And globalization was real, and it just had this tremendous force. And as I think about it, one thing it did was to pull those brilliant young men, the sons of the elite of every country in the region, towards London, towards New York, towards this incredible new machine of wealth creation and orderly business. And in coupling them to one world, Davos world, that Tom and I have each inhabited, it decoupled them from their own countries. Their role as the elites, the leaders, the people who would help their people from their villages towards this future, I think in some way was avoided. So their children now work for Goldman Sachs. Their children go to Stanford and Harvard and Cambridge. And there is one world for our friends. But everybody else kind of got left behind. And we've seen, as the globalization world spin faster and faster, the rage and sense of shame and dispossession of the people left behind also grew. And so I'll just start there by saying, as I think back on where we were, that's what's happened, and I think that's a central part of the problem.
That's a very astute point.
That's great, David. And it's a treat to share the stage with David. We've been colleagues since the late 1970s in Beirut. That's a long time. We're both really old. We are, and there's only one person I change my travel plans for, or squeeze them into, and that's for Kareem, who is without a doubt the premier Iran analyst in this town, I think in the country. So it's great to be here. Kareem, as I was listening to your question, I was remembering a moment, April 18, I believe was the day, 1983. I was in my apartment in Manara in West Beirut. It was a Monday, and they were going to announce the Pulitzer Prizes that day. And I had been nominated for my coverage of Sabra and Shatila. And it was 1:06 p.m., and I was sitting in my office at my house, had my feet on my desk, and I had a little thing, it was called a transistor radio, sitting on the edge of my desk. And I was listening to the BBC World Service 1 o'clock news. And at 1:06 p.m., a blast went off that so shook my apartment in Manara that it knocked the radio off my desk. And I did what we always did then, which is I simply ran downstairs and waited to hear if I heard sirens. If you heard sirens, it meant something bad. If you didn't hear sirens, it meant that it was an Israeli plane that had broken the sound barrier. The sirens quickly emerged, and I started running toward what I saw was a very large mushroom cloud curling in the air. And I simply ran toward it. And I got closer, and I said, it couldn't be. And then I got closer, I said, no, it couldn't be. And then I turned that corner that David knows well around the American University of Beirut, and there was the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, blown in half like a doll's house. And you could see offices and people and bodies in the smoldering ruins. And, of course, there was no security perimeter. You sort of had to walk there and talk to people. And I stopped an American official I knew. Ryan Crocker was one of the people staggering in the ruins, then the junior political officer at the embassy. And I stopped this guy and I said, what happened? And he said, we think that a man, a driver, drove a truck up the driveway of the embassy, up the stairs, into the lobby, and blew it up. Now, there's two things about that story you should take note of. One, you could walk right into the U.S. Embassy in Beirut in April 1982. Walk right up the front stairs and present your credentials. But my first reaction was, you mean he blew himself up? Are you telling me he committed suicide? It seemed to me like the most foreign, unlikely thing you could possibly imagine. And little did I know that it wasn't the first, we now know it's actually the second, that the Iraqi embassy in Beirut was actually the first. We had heard at the time that they thought that maybe a guy blew himself up in the garage of that embassy. And of course, that was the first time we met Hezbollah and the whole phenomena of suicide bombing. And little did I know, again, that I'd be covering that impact all these years later. I think David's really on to something very important in his analysis. And I would just say very quickly, just to get this idea out there, because I think is going to be the subject of my next book. I think that the world is actually cleaving today into a new divide, and the new divide is the world of order versus the world of disorder. And the world of order is divided up between two kinds of states, states with sustainable order, order based on consensual politics, and states of imposed order. So Russia today is in the world of order, but it's imposed order. And the price of imposed order is growing every week in either human terms or in actual dollars and cents. So I think that's the big divide in the world. And I actually think what's happening in the world today is that the reason we're seeing that divide is that three giant forces, and David alluded to one of them, the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law, have all entered an exponential phase. Moore's Law, meaning the power of microchips and speed will double every 18 to 24 months. We're now in that exponential phase where the doubling gets extremely large. That's an idea from Andy McAfee and Eric Ben Jolson's book, The Second Machine Age. But what I add to it is that globalization, as David talked about, has entered the doubling phase, and the impact of Mother Nature, both climate and demographics. Now, all three of these giant forces, what they're doing is that they're stressing out strong states, and they are blowing up weak states. Weak states that during the Cold War would have been buttressed by the United States or the Soviet Union. We would have aided them, we would have given them money, we would have given them arms, and weak states that were protected in a pre-globalization world by walls of protectionism. The walls are gone. The buttressing of the superpowers is gone. My wife and I were just in Madagascar, went to see the president there, and his palace, you couldn't make this up, was built by the North Koreans. It's like a definition of how you know you're poor, you know. But nevertheless, just the mere fact of it is so telling. And so you have these three giant forces now acting on the world, and it is stressing out big states, and it is actually blowing up weak states. And therefore, I think the main project of American foreign policy going forward is how we take states that have imposed order and make them more decent, states that are decent that we strengthen, and that we all collaborate together to either isolate or remediate the world of disorder. I think that's what's going on.
I know that both of you have been consulted by the president on this issue, and I wanted to ask two specific questions about.
Never consulted, but we've been in conversation.
We've interviewed the president.
Being very modest, both of them.
Yeah. We consult him. He has to pay, in my case, 75 cents. In Tom's case, $1.50.
That's how we advise him through our columns.
So, in dealing with ISIS, there's a couple of specific questions I'd like to ask. The first, and I'll preface it by saying that in the United States over the last decade, one of the best-selling books has been a book by a pastor called Rick Warren called The Purpose-Driven Life, which has sold over 30 million copies. And when you read interviews with folks who have joined groups like, whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda, especially folks who have joined from outside the Middle East, from Brussels or London or elsewhere, it's not, the motivation is not escaping poverty, but finding a sense of purpose. You know, what am I here to do? And it's quite remarkable. I was actually living through Purpose-Driven Life last night, and some of the parallels were quite interesting about, you know, how Rick Warren's Key for Happiness and, you know, a lot of the things that these people who join radical groups are motivated by. So, is there a liberal? There certainly isn't yet a liberal democratic equivalent of the purpose-driven life in the Middle East. You know, how do we, in order to curtail the power of a narrative like that, you need an alternative narrative. You know, what's happening with that? And second point is that you could argue that a group like ISIS is in many ways a byproduct of two contemporary events, which is the Syrian civil war, which has provided tremendous disenfranchisement for the Sunni Arab community in Syria, and the Shia ascendancy in Iraq, which has also disenfranchised the Iraqi Sunni community. Now, there looks to be some type of a political transition taking place in Iraq, but in the case of Syria, my question is, can you really, quote unquote, eradicate ISIS, as President Obama has said will do, without getting rid of Bashar al-Assad? So, Tom, why don't you start out?
Well, I'm going to pick up again with something David said. You said very rightly, Karim, that ISIS makes the PLO look like a knitting circle and makes Al Qaeda look like the poor and crippled newsboys. So what's happening in the water? So I wrote a while back, actually, using a formulation by an Israeli analyst, Orit Perlov, that unfortunately in the Arab world today, there are really just two models, ISIS and SISI. You either got ISIS or you have Sisi, okay? There are just two models. There's either ISIS or Sisi. So there's either authoritarian military or this kind of jihadist radicalism, with its variants, the Muslim Brotherhood and whatnot. I think the explanation for ISIS's absolute barbarism is that the Sisi people have gotten worse, and therefore the ISIS people have gotten worse. They are the offspring of a civil war in which the Syrian government, with barrel bombs, has killed 190,000 of its own people. So when that's your school, and by the way, and the world seemed to be kind of cool with that, when that's your school, it's no wonder that's what happens in the playground. And so I think there's a real interaction between those. I think that my view of what the president announced yesterday and what we should do going forward to deal with this immediate problem. There's an immediate problem and a longer-term problem. I'll just talk about the immediate one for now and let David go. The president talked about degrading and defeating, and I think we should separate those two. I think what we can actually do from the air, and we've already proven it, is to degrade ISIS's capability, and so we've stopped their advance to a large degree. And over time, if we really take this seriously, we could actually shrink ISIS capability from the air. Only Arabs and Muslims can actually defeat ISIS. We can shrink it. We can turn them into, like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like the Pakistani Taliban, another terrorist group that has a slice of territory, isolated, that doesn't really threaten anybody. I mean, in a macro sense. But only Arabs and Muslims can defeat them, because ISIS is a product of two civil wars. The civil war within Sunni Islam between jihadists and mainstream Sunnis, and the larger civil war between Sunnis and Shia. And unless you resolve both those civil wars, you can't create the foundation for decent governance based on citizenship rather than identity politics. And so I think the president actually understands this. I think his expectations are fully in check. We'll use our power to that degree, and I think he is absolutely right to say we can only do so much. You're going to have to take ownership of the rest. And if you don't, there is no sustainable, self-sustaining solution to the problem.
I should start by saying that I think the most generous thing ever said about ISIS is that it may in some way have an intellectual link to Rick Ward and the Purpose-Driven Life. Don't let Fox News get a hold of that.
Excise that from the transcript.
Tom and I are going to keep endorsing each other like a ping pong match, but that's been the case for,
We've been doing it for a
35
while.
years. So what the heck? I would add to what Tom said. From the time I first came into the Arab world, I think Iraq was the first Arab country I visited when the Iraq-Iran war broke out, and then Lebanon, and then everywhere else. I've felt that I was looking at a broken political culture. In addition to the decoupling of the elites, just this sense of living in mukhabarat states, which is as extreme with Sisi as it's been, but it's been a pretty much permanent condition of modern life in the Arab countries. And What we've seen in the last few years is the revolt of the citizen, much as was seen in Iran in 1979, where the average person said, I'm not going to take it anymore, and I'm not afraid of you. You know, the secret police who kept me in check, who stepped on me, who humiliated my father, who would shame me tomorrow, who take my dignity away every day, I'm not afraid of you anymore. And Tom and I saw that in Tahrir Square in February 2011, and it's powerful. It's unforgettable. And I'm sorry to say it, but ISIS is in part a warped kind of hyperdrive version of that assertion of dignity. I am somebody. You can't push me around. And it's been taken, to almost a psychotic level. I think this all begins with, in modern times, with the Iranian Revolution. That's still the central, that's the earthquake that started all the other earthquakes, and everything's still rumbling from 1979. And when I'm despairing about the Arab world, I think, how long did it take Europe to assimilate the shock waves of the French Revolution in 1789? And you can pick your own, 30 years, 40 years. I've written that one thing that happened after the French Revolution was that the nations of Europe got together under the leadership of Henry Kissinger's intellectual model, Count Metternich, and decided on a concert of Europe, as it was called, that reconciled the revolutionary powers, France, rising Prussia, assertive Russia, with the status quo powers, who at that time were Austria-Hungary, and Great Britain. Something like that is going to be the way that this period ends, if it ends. There will be something very similar in which the rising powers, revolutionary Iran, the other revolutions in the Sunni world that in a sense are emulative, are reconciled with the status quo powers led by the United States and its allies. Tom and I heard at the White House the other day that the intriguing possibility that ISIS is so toxic that it has opened a space in which Saudi Arabia and Iran see their interests as being parallel, at least. And does that open a space in which they could begin to talk about this sectarian insanity that they've each been fueling that's destroying their part of the world? And if that were so, then I would think that this yearning for dignity, this yearning of the citizen, could take place in an architecture as happened in Europe. Think of how Europe built out in the 19th century, all the expansions of human possibility, once you stabilize the structure. So forgive the maybe far-fetched historical analogy, but that is how I think of it. And I wish we had a statesman like Count Metternich, or Henry Kissinger for that matter, who could really see this big and try something very ambitious.
Now, I'd like to ask both of you how you are covering now the Middle East as journalists, given how inaccessible so many countries throughout the region have been rendered. David, you were at the U.S. Embassy a couple hours before it was bombed in Beirut.
30 minutes.
30 minutes before it was bombed. Tom
was waiting, listening to his transistor radio. I was walking out the door at 12:30. Yeah. Thank goodness.
And from Beirut to Jerusalem, Tom, you talk about your close brushes with danger then. But a lot of the top foreign correspondents of your generation cut their teeth covering the Lebanese civil war. Yeah. I'm curious, if you were beginning your careers now, would you go cover the Syrian war?
I would have studied Chinese, I think. So I have, like David, I've been to Syria a couple times and very quick visits. One, literally a few hours. And the second one is part of doing a documentary for Showtime last year on climate change in Syria, and I went in with a film crew. But even that was for half a day, basically. I would not go to Syria. And I would not go to Iraq right now myself. We were talking outside, they're just, in the old days, you'd literally go anywhere. The only thing that limited you in the old days was where you got a visa. Who gave you a visa? And now it's really who will give you protection. And those are two different things. And I'm not going to speak in detail about this, but Western news agencies have provided a wonderful post-retirement employment opportunity for a whole host of British SAS officers. And the idea that that's how you have to operate with an SAS escort team, which unfortunately is the case, it really tells you how dangerous it is. And so I think this is just a huge problem, because if you like to do journalism the way David and I do, which is to actually base your opinions on what's going on the ground and not on theoretical constructs determined by the left or the right, the fact that you actually can't go to the ground, you can't actually make your own judgments about those ISIS guys by sitting in a circle with them and saying, what is this about? And hearing what they say, and then digesting that, and putting it in some kind of framework and larger context. And everything has to be mediated, therefore, through other people's journalism, through contrived kind of press conferences. This, to me, is just a huge problem, because if you can't lay hands on the story yourself, your ability, I think, to analyze it and to contribute to the public debate in a productive way, and not just station identification, I think is just really limited, and it's really a tragedy. The number of countries in the Middle East you can go to now is rapidly shrinking. I was the graduation speaker at the American University of Kurdistan, Suleimania, 3 days before ISIS happened.
Wow.
And they didn't see it coming.
Tells you something. David?
I shouldn't talk about journalists at risk, especially with an Iranian-American audience, without mentioning my colleague, Jason Rezaian, who is imprisoned in Tehran now for reasons that are still unclear, and illustrates a different aspect of the danger. And, my colleagues, and I hope all of you, to the extent it's possible, will help get this very talented, decent journalist free. In the time that was when Tom and I began covering the Middle East, we were able to pretty much go anywhere that we had the stomach for, because people wanted us to come. They wanted us to tell their stories. We were carrying an invisible white flag as correspondents. I was then working for the Wall Street Journal, Tom for the New York Times, and they wanted us to go across the Green Line, in Beirut to see the Kataib, the Christian militia, or go into the Shuf to see the Druze or wherever, because we were important, and being in the New York Times mattered. Arafat was a press maniac. I mean, he really thought the AP and the New York Times, kind of ran the world, and you'd have to wait until 2 or 3 in the morning to go see him. But he cared passionately about speaking to the world through us. People don't feel they need us anymore, which is one reason that they don't want us. And when we get near them, they kidnap us. They now want to communicate with the world directly through Twitter, through their own jihadist videos, through all the things that we see. And so social media has rendered our job less valuable to the people we want to go interview. It's no less valuable to our readers or the world. That's the paradox. People may not want us to come in, but it's all the more important that we do. This is a world where you really have to be careful, and sometimes you have to travel with security. I think it's a place where journalists every day take risks to tell you what you need to know. I mean, the extent to which they are taking their risks and kind of quietly, not telling you about it, it's just so wonderful. It's really admirable. And people should be aware of it. If I had a child who wanted to be a journalist, I would not tell them not to cover the Middle East. I'd make sure that they knew what they were getting in for. And the rule that I've always followed, and I'll tell a brief story to illustrate it, but is make sure that what you're going after is worth it, so that if something bad happened, you could say to yourself, that wasn't a crazy thing I did. What I was going after really made sense, and the guy who's got the knife at my throat, it was, nothing's really worth it, but that was worth it. On one of my trips into Syria in October 2012, I went to Aleppo. I spent 2 days traveling. I was traveling with the so-called moderate opposition, who were just as ragtag and disorganized as you've read. They were a mess. And I was handed off from one person to the next person, and we got into the center of Aleppo, into the front line, and the mortar rounds were landing nearby. And then somebody said, "And now, Mr. David, we'd like you to go with Abdul Hamid." And I'd already been handed off twice, and Mr. Abdul Hamid is going to take you to so-and-so, and then we'd like you to stay overnight here and not go back to where you thought you were going back to. And that was really a gut check moment. And I said, after thinking about it for 30 seconds, no, I'm not going to. But Mr. David, you have to. And I've always wondered, Foley, the man who was killed several weeks ago, was kidnapped within a month of the time I was there, and not very far from where I was. So, I think you have to make decisions in those situations and make them. The reason I said no, to be honest, was I couldn't answer my question. Are you confident? I already had enough to do the column I wanted to write. Are you going to get enough more that this is worth? And the answer is no. So I guess I'd give a slightly different answer than Tom. I suspect we'd give the same. So long as you're structuring this in a rational way, it's really important that people keep doing the kind of work that we were trained to do. If we stop doing it, bad people have won, and we can't stop doing it. So, you have to be very careful every minute of their day.
Do you guys find Facebook and Twitter useful tools in your research?
I don't really use either. I know who my friends are, number one, and number two, I really like all my news tartar as much as I can. I don't like it filtered through anything or any algorithm. And I like to talk to people face to face to the extent that I can. And so they're not, for me, a source of.
What about you, David?
I certainly use Twitter as a publishing platform for my own work, and that draws me into looking at Twitter. If I read Arabic, I think I'd find it a more useful tool, and looking at what's trending, what's hot, certainly is valuable. I am struck by the way in which the power of Twitter in countries like Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in all of these countries that are where revolution has been going on, it allows you to spontaneously bring people together. The hashtag revolutions really were that. The hashtags were an immediate concentrating force. I guess Iran shows you that a security service that organizes aggressively to break the social media world, the power of the hashtags, succeeds.
You wrote, Tom, at that time, bang, bang beats tweet, tweet. Yeah. So I have a couple more questions, so get your own questions ready. But I wanted to move on to the issue of U.S. policy. And if you recall, in 2003, there was this debate in Washington whether the road to peace in the Middle East went through Baghdad or through Jerusalem. Those who argued Jerusalem said we need to get an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal, and that will transform the region into a more decent, tolerant, democratic place. And those who argued for the Iraq war said, no, we need to change the leadership in Baghdad, and that will transform the region. Now, I think for the duration of President Obama's presidency, it's going to be too late to come up with a new strategy. It's going to simply be reacting to the crisis taking place now. But as we get ready for Hillary Clinton presidency or a Mitt Romney presidency, and these two camps are planning their strategies from scratch, where would you advise them to start if you want to bring about a more decent, tolerant region? Which capital is most important to that?
I don't think any capital is singularly important, Kareem, from our point of view. I think where I've really come to is, first of all, just total humility. It's pretty clear on a bipartisan level we don't know what the hell we're doing. We've amply demonstrated that fact. And I have a motto about the Middle East, and it really is for me a guiding motto, which is that the Middle East only puts a smile on your face when it starts with them. Yeah. Camp David started in a secret meeting between Tahami and Dayan in Morocco. Oslo is not called Dayton. It's called Oslo because Israelis and Palestinians met in Oslo for a year before we found out about it. And with all due respect to General Petraeus, the Anbar uprising began by local sheikhs saying, "You're not going to marry my daughter. You know, this is my country," etc. We can then amplify what they start, but we cannot start for them. And the best evidence of that is how the surge failed in Afghanistan, because in Anbar it was like this and we met it, and in Afghanistan it was like this and we met nothing. So I'm always asking, one of the just real liabilities at work in the politics in that part of the world, and it's been fed by some Western academics, Arabs and Muslims have agency. We're not the only ones with agency. And buying into the notion that only we have agency and you don't is a really debilitating and paralyzing thing. And sometimes we buy into it. So our debate becomes so incredibly solipsistic. It's all about what Obama does or doesn't do. And that the Middle East rides on that. So I really believe, first of all, it's got to start there. The second guiding principle for me, and David referred to Tahrir Square, and to me Tahrir Square, all of the uprisings can be reduced to one thing. Young people living in what I call a flat world, an even flatter world now, where they can see how everybody else is living, understanding at a gut level that they do not have the tools to realize their full potential. And you want to create a revolution, whether it's in a neighborhood in D.C., or in Tehran or in Cairo, just put people in a context where they can see how everybody else is living and strip them of the tools to realize their full potential, and give them at the same time the communications tools to connect up and share that view with other people. So for me, I kind of walk it backwards. If that's the core problem, then what do you do to ameliorate it, that we can contribute to? But it's got to start with them. I just make two other quick points, on this. I'm a golfer. I'm a golf fanatic, and I believe there are basically just two kind of golfers and two kind of countries. Okay, and I learned this lesson from an interview that Bruce Edwards gave. He was Tom Watson's caddy for a long time. For those of you who don't know, a great golfer. And then for 3 years he was Greg Norman's caddy, and then he went back to being Tom Watson's caddy. And he gave an interview in which he was asked by Golf Digest, what's the difference between Greg Norman and Tom Watson? And he said, it's very simple. They both hit a 300-yard drive down the middle of the fairway, and they both end up in a divot. And Greg Norman says, can you believe this, Bruce? I'm in a divot. If I didn't have bad luck, I'd have no luck at all. Can you believe I'm in this divot? I hit that right down the middle. Who did this to me? Tom Watson would say, Bruce, watch this. There are two kind of countries. I'm behind, what did you do to me? I'm behind, what's wrong with me? And way too many countries out there are in the I'm behind, what did you do to me? And externalizing both the responsibility and the energy to do something about it. Now, let me just make one more point about this. I think the single greatest thing we underestimate about that part of the world, and it can come from a little too much Twitter and too much Facebook, is thinking that it's all about ideology, it's all about big ideas, it's all about, Thawrat al-Nasr and revolution, and all this kind of stuff. To me, the two most seminal events or experiences I covered since the Arab Awakening, one was in Kirkuk and one was in Cairo. I was in Cairo for the last day of voting for the first election in Egypt that elected Morsi ultimately. Remember, the voting was over a period of weeks. I went to an all-women's voting station in Shubra, which is the poorest neighborhood in Cairo, at an elementary school that none of your kids should ever be condemned to have to go to. I stood outside with our Egyptian translator, and we interviewed roughly 20 women when they came out. Every single one was covered. And 19 voted for Morsi and 1 voted for the Waft. And I asked each one, why did you vote for Morsi? Oh, very simple. Better sidewalks, more street lights, more jobs, more security and police in my neighborhood, better local schools. There wasn't one who said, if I see another bikini on the streets of Alexandria, on the beaches, I'm going to just die. I'm going to blow somebody up. Yet if you listen to the whole Muslim Brotherhood narrative, it was all about governance. We totally underestimate how starved Arabs and Muslims are in that region for decent, clean governance. All the things that we actually care about in our lives. Second experience, I did the commencement at the University of Kurdistan. After the commencement, I'm at a dinner, and I'm seated next to the governor of Kirkuk. And I said, Kirkuk, I was there 5 years earlier with Admiral Mullen. I had to go in an MRAP. It was so dangerous. We had to run from the MRAP into the city hall. He said, Mr. Friedman, you should come again, because I just got reelected. By the way, in a free and fair election, Kirkuk had a Kurdish governor. The city council in Kirkuk at the time was, I meant this exactly right, but it's structurally right. It had 6 Kurds, 2 Turkmen, and 2 Sunni Arabs. After the election, there were 8 Kurds, 1 Turkmen, and 1 Sunni Arab. In other words, he got reelected on Sunni and Turkmen votes, a Kurdish governor. And I changed my whole plan, and I said to my host, you're taking me to Kirkuk. Went to Kirkuk, and you could just see it when you got it. Roundabouts, parks. The guy fixed and reopened all the broken schools. Guess what? Arabs and Muslims want the same thing you want in your neighborhood here, and they are so starved for that. And the tragedy is that's where Maliki failed on so many levels, but on that level most profoundly.
That's right. David, about road to peace in the Middle East.
I'm going to disagree slightly with Tom. It's a rare point of disagreement, but Tom and I have talked about this. I think I believe that American leadership in this region remains more important, and its absence remains more dangerous than Tom does. I think he's right for sure about the need for humility. What I like best about President Obama's speech Wednesday night is that it is the speech of a reluctant warrior who really doesn't want to do this and who knows just how weary his country is of war and how weary the world is of having America drop bombs on Muslims. And he's doing it reluctantly and with humility. On Kareem's question, Jerusalem or Baghdad, I want to say both, but I want to introduce a slightly different theme, because I think in terms of what the United States can do, this really is the centerpiece. And the road to peace lies through Tehran. And, I mean, stabilizing this region is going to require, over time, the United States finding a language that speaks to Iranians, draws them into some new architecture for security in the region, reconciles their interests and those of Saudi Arabia without conceding to their revolution and letting them win. I'm not sure that's possible yet. Iran still looks like it wants to win, but it's becoming more possible. I think we've all been encouraged. Speaking for myself, I've been encouraged by the way in which creative, aggressive American diplomacy working very cleverly initially in secret through Oman, principally, with chapters that are not yet told about that story. Succeeded in opening a dialogue with the Iranian regime that has been handled quite sensibly, as near as I can tell, on both sides. And, if you had to guess right now what will happen 24 November when this cycle of negotiations ends, will we have a deal? The answer probably right now is no. But there certainly is a lot to build on. And I just have to think that ordinary Iranians in Tehran are beginning to feel almost on their fingertips what it would be like to be connected to the world again. And I think they want it passionately. And I think if the regime insists on going the other way, over time, people will reject that. Mm-hmm. So I want to see the U.S. stay in that game, and it would be a mistake, especially with this audience, not to mention this is something that I find encouraging. I doubt that we're at the breakthrough point quite yet, but I think it's coming. I do.
Well, that's a perfect segue to my last question, because two of my favorite quotes about Iran are associated with both of you. Tom, it was during one of your trips in the early 2000s one of your trips to Tehran, in which you said, Iranians have experienced enough democracy to know they want more of it, and enough Islamism to know they want less of it. Mm-hmm. And David, I think one of the seminal quotes about Iran is something you extracted from Henry Kissinger in an interview you did with him, in which he said Iran has to decide whether it's a nation or a cause. And I'm just curious to ask you a very broad macro question about your own experiences in Iran, having experienced mostly the Arab world, kind of culturally, politically. How do you see Iran and the Arab world being different?
The most striking thing for me, Karim, from my first trip there, which is in the late 90s, then they banned me for life, and then they let me back in and banned me for life again. So, but I think I'm okay now again.
No, it's being very modest, but yeah. the column which got him banned was incredibly prescient. It was entitled Shah Khamenei, at a time when no one was talking about Khamenei in the late 90s.
And the guy who gave me my visa was the current foreign minister.
Is that right?
Yeah. And he got called before Parliament to explain that. So, I always had a soft spot for him. The first thing that strikes you in Tehran when you're coming, let's just make it exaggerate, from Saudi Arabia, is that there's real politics here. Yes, it's constricted, it's limited, but there's real politics. That's the thing. And the other is the role of women in society and in politics is just really strikes you. So, I have a very simple view of it. I really believe in history and geography. And history and geography says Iran is a great civilization that needs to be, always was, and eventually will again be connected with the world. Yeah. As a Jew, I have a soft spot for a country that protected and really enriched in many ways Jewish life and culture for so many years. I think this period is not a natural period. And history and geography, I don't know if it'll be in my lifetime or I hope it will be, but says that Iran is a great civilization. It's nourished the world and been nourished by the world. And this state of isolation is not natural. Yeah,
I think that's music to the ears of so many in the audience. So, David.
The quote from Kissinger, I wish I could take credit for having extracted that from him. I'm not sure you can extract any quote from Henry Kissinger, but he had said that before, and I've quoted it often. The quote that I thought you were going to refer to that came from my trip there in 2006 was something like, "No country that requires drivers to wear seatbelts is, an irreconcilable enemy of the United States." I was just amazed that seatbelt wearing in Tehran really is taken seriously. I will note, in answer to your question, that when I was in Tehran in December, at the invitation of Foreign Minister Zarif, I put to him Kissinger's dictum, that Iran has to decide whether it's a nation or a cause, and asked him, are you ready to turn the corner? And he gave a two-part answer. First, on this idea that I've been talking about in different ways today of turning a corner toward a security architecture that includes Iran and its regional rivals. Zarif is a passionate enthusiast. He's written himself about it. He is very articulate in describing it. On the question of whether we're a nation or cause, he said, we're both. So are you. I mean, what American would ever accept the idea that you're just a nation? You stand for something. You see yourselves as exceptional. And we do too. That's part of being an Iranian. We think we're an exceptional people. So I note that. I put it also to Hussein Shariat Madari, the editor of Kayhan, who was as close as I could get to Khamenei. And he gave me an answer that was frightening. He said, essentially, we are a cause, we are a revolution. There is an attempt now to stop that revolution and compromise it. The foreign minister has lied to the president. The president has misrepresented the situation to the supreme leader. I will do everything I can to stop it. And we can never compromise. You want us, you want us to bend. You want us to bend our revolution in your direction. We've always feared this. We've always known it was coming. And I'll do everything, to my dying breath to stop it. That's what he'd say. But to hear it, with that passion on the record, I quoted it in my column, I found just chilling. Because it's a reminder that there are people who say, on the question, do you want to compromise? Say, absolutely not. We won't do it. And I don't know, again, my guess is those forces are still strong enough to block an acceptable deal by the 24th of November. But I'd close just the way Tom did by saying, I'd be amazed in our lifetime if it doesn't happen. And in fact, a lot sooner than that.
Yeah. So now is question time. If you can just identify yourself and be as concise as possible. I'll take three at once. Why don't we start here with the lady in the front? And if you can wait for the microphone, please. It's behind you.
My name is Huri Khalilian, and I'm an attorney in D.C. I appreciate your comments about the recent events, and I have a specific question to your gentleman, David, sitting here. Originally, when you started the topic, you were referring to the root causes of this tragedy that we have in the world right now. And as we all know, of course, this is a conglomerate of many events and facts. And it's very, very risky to oversimplify any facts. And having said that, if we don't really understand and recognize the causes that have led the 20th century and some part of 21st century into this that we are facing today, we may never be able to find a right solution. So having said that, I would like to emphasize on the importance of a question that I have for you. When you suggested that a reason, or maybe one reason for what we are facing in the world is the globalization of 1980s, and the fact that globalization caused the brain power to fled their original countries and come to the West, and basically then the homeland was left without any supervision. That I have an issue regarding the premise
Can you have to pose a question? Many
logic.
people want to ask.
Okay, sorry, I'll make it faster. Deduction of the logic that you had from that premise, because there may be other causes. For example, most importantly comes to the mind is economical disparity and the fact that some people will have more money now to come to the West. And also when you compare that to the situation in Iran, it was maybe a somewhat contradictory, because an Iranian revolution, again, I cannot be conclusive, but somewhat was to do with a lot of educated people who have actually had money come to the West and came back to Iran. And because of the poverty, which you correctly noted, people were fed up with the system. And then that the whole thing caused revolution. So at the end, I would like to say each country has to be checked separately.
Okay, thank you. So hold on to these thoughts. And if I can please ask you to be quite concise, because there are many, many hands up. Well, let's go in the way back. We'll come back to the front. There's a gentleman there in the way back.
Thank you. Hanif Kashani, Brookings Institution. I wanted to ask the panelists their take on President Obama not mentioning Iran in his Wednesday address regarding ISIS. Thanks.
Thank you. And why don't we, actually, Furu, please.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. I just wondered the role of mothers and women in the Middle East, Tom. And I'm wondering that as a mother, I want the best for my kids, right? And I'm wondering if we empower them through education and allowing them to send their daughters to school and providing hope. I think lack of hope is one reason that maybe the sons join, and mothers allow their sons to join ISIS and such. As a country, should we invest even more into education and helping those countries come out of poverty and then have some hope, to not allow their kids to go into ISIS or similar groups? Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we start with those?
Well, it's a very good question to start right there. And actually, after the Arab Spring, the column I wrote was that I thought in response to the Arab Spring, what we should do is take $100 million out of our defense budget and build science and technology high schools called the Arab Spring High Schools from Aswan to Alexandria, and actually honor the revolution where it happened, which is young people looking for the tools to succeed. But having said that, again, if you don't have the local environment that's going to nurture, protect, and advance those schools, that's a problem too. So what's chicken and what's egg here is unclear. Roughly 56% more than half the women in Egypt can't read today, after $50 billion in American aid. So about 25% of the men. So nothing good can come of that. We know from every other country in development theory that $1 invested in women's education, it could be the single most important dollar you invest in any country to begin a turnaround. So absolutely right. To the question about why did Obama not mention Iran, because nothing good can come from that. Basically, we're in a situation where, on the one hand, we need a certain amount of tacit cooperation. On the other hand, we've taken the decision that ISIS is the near and most important enemy, but we still have a huge problem with the role that Iran played and probably will continue to play in Iraq. We have an agenda with Iran. Iran built and designed the exploding penetrating shells that killed more Americans, courtesy of the pro-Iranian Shiite militias in Iraq, than any other single device. So, there's a lot of people in the U.S. military haven't forgotten that. And Iran basically pushed Maliki to go to the edge. And Maliki doing what he did triggered ISIS is many things, but one thing it is a Sunni counter-revolution. So I don't see what benefit the president would have had by starting a fight here, suggesting that we need Iran, therefore Iran will use that in the nuclear talks. Some things are best not said.
Well put. David?
On the question that was directed to me, I think it's true that Iran's elites have decoupled from their society less than some other elites in that part of the world. I mean, and I'm struck. I just had dinner last night with a Iranian American who just was back visiting her family properties and reconnecting at some personal risk. So I think that's a fair comment. I think, just to note Tom's point, part of what makes this policy of Obama's so delicate is that it's essential to maintain Sunni buy-in and support for a policy that is, as our policies have been since 2003, frankly, in parallel with Iran. I mean, they play both sides of the street, but we went after their biggest enemies in both Baghdad and Kabul, and that's part of what has been so disturbing to our Sunni friends. So, what's interesting, yesterday's most interesting news development in some ways was the Jeddah communique, which was signed in Saudi Arabia, and it was interesting for who was on the list. Yes, there were the predictable GCC countries, plus Jordan, plus I think Morocco, plus Lebanon, which is a proxy for Hezbollah, effectively, plus Iraq, which is a proxy for Shia power. That's different. And that says that the Sunnis understand what this game is, and they're willing to play it with us if we don't poke them in the eye.
So next round of questions. Let's start here in the front. If you can identify yourself.
Hi, Faraj Sagri with Paya, and I also work for JP Morgan. Thank you.
I think you work for JP Morgan and also work with Paya. My guess is.
Well, Tom, in this audience, with really? I reversed it.
That's okay.
But
I appreciated that.
And
I
wish
right
David
away.
had mentioned JP Morgan instead of Goldman Sachs. But anyway, look, first, very briefly, let me just thank you, all three of you. It's just an amazing education for all of us. But a quick question: Can America address any of these issues, or help to address any of these issues, whether it be the road to peace through Tehran or Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or Syria, without or the ISIS-Sisi two sides of the coin, without fundamentally addressing our relationship with the Arab world, where we have typically supported over 60, 70 years the regimes in place today? That's my question.
Thank you. Now let's go to the back. Any females in the back? We'll go to, if there is. Yeah, please.
Hi, I have a question for both Tom
Nazila
and
Fatih.
David. Nazila Fatih, former New York Times correspondent.
Nazila is the former New York Times Tehran correspondent.
I wanted to ask about these second-generation immigrants who are going back to the region, a lot of them to Iraq, Syria, and have become the face of violence. A lot of them grew up in quite civilized environments in Europe. A couple of them were even Canadian and Americans, not second-generation immigrants. What's happening? Is this a threat? Is this a sign that terrorist organizations are reaching far beyond their territories, using websites, internets to recruit members? Is this a serious threat?
Thank you, Nazila. And was there a question here? No. Ruzbe Piruz.
Yeah, I had a question about this whole thing with Sisi and ISIS and so on. I mean, I generally agree with you that there's a tendency in the region to blame outsiders and foreigners far more than they ought to be blamed. And but one area which has been puzzling to me, and it seems like a very absurd kind of mistake to make when you look at it with a longer-term perspective, is why we don't allow the process of democracy and rule to delegitimize the very people that we're trying to delegitimize, namely the Islamists. This happened, for example, with Hamas, where the election result was overturned. It's quite possible that a few years of Hamas running the place and people realizing that they weren't up for it would have completely killed their popular legitimacy. And then again with Sisi, I mean, whose idea was that? I mean, okay, Morsi wasn't obviously God's gift to leadership, but he had accepted Camp David. He more or less adopted a democratic constitution. And yet some people somewhere, whether it was the Saudis or I don't know who it was, came up with this brilliant plan to kill 1,200 people in broad daylight and put back in place the most ruthless military dictatorship. And it was very clear that a year after Morsi being into office, the Muslim Brotherhood was very diminished. 3 or 4 years down the line, they could have been completely spent as a political force. So why does this happen? And who's behind it? And why do we keep making that mistake?
Thank you. And Ruzbe is the only Rhodes Scholar that's living currently in Tehran. And thank you for coming, Ruzbe. Tom, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start with the last question. I confess, maybe it's misplaced, but I just have an allergy, a radical allergy to conspiracy theories. Okay, which in the Middle East you can get that rash just by getting off the airplane. So, I believe this was, and I was in Egypt at the time. This was Egyptians. Now, the reason it was Egyptians had to do some of the very complex chemistry of a lot of Egyptians who thought they gave Morsi a chance and felt that he stole something. There was an enormous sense of theft. Yes, standing back from one side, you say, well, he accepted Camp David, but then he also, the people he was appointing, the people he was pushing out. By the way, I'm not an advocate for either side in this, but boy, this was deeply, deeply rooted. And it's a very complicated historical process, how the Muslim Brotherhood, which was, when there was a Mubarak regime there, was the opposition, had the mantle, the halo of the opposition. They took Mubarak out and they governed and they were losing it, but it was a very complicated thing. Now, that was the root of it, but you are absolutely right. It was fanned, nourished, and encouraged by Gulf money. And what your question to me really reinforces is the incredibly perverse role that oil has played in this whole region. You cannot divorce the exceptionalism of this region to all the democratic trends in the world since the 1980s from the presence of oil and the fact that if you could capture the oil tap, no matter what minority you were, you could both buy off enough people and buy enough arms to keep your people down. And unless that changes, I despair for the whole region. I always, whenever I go to India, I say to my Indian friends, you are so blessed. Such a lucky people, such a lucky people. You have no natural resources. How did you get so lucky? Okay. But of course, because they had no natural resources, they developed the DNA over millennia of both learning to live together and drilling and tapping their people, men and women, for their energy and creativity, not the ground. And until you take that out of the equation, and we could have just talked about all of that today as the source of the main problem, because that's what also brings us in. Why are we interested in what's going on in the Middle East and not what's going on in Chad today? It's OIL and no other reason. To Nazila's point, and I won't embarrass her by telling people that she was my reporter, assistant, colleague all the times I was in Tehran, but I won't tell anybody that. It's and a great one. The Iranians lost most by the fact that she's not here, able to tell their story. She's not there. But to me, it really, there's stuff, now I think it's just unknowable in human beings, but there is somewhere for a complicated set of reasons, and we could have done this whole conversation, but if you sit down with young Arabs and Muslims in Europe, men in particular, and you take out a stopwatch, I will bet you any amount of money, because I've done it, I did a documentary about this, that within 5 minutes they will bring up and use the word humiliated or humiliation. Why that is has to do with some very complex things that have to do with the state of Islam today and Islamic areas vis-a-vis other faiths and how well it's doing in the modern world. And it's worth a whole seminar, okay? But the single most, if I've learned one thing as a journalist, is that it's that the single most powerful human emotion is humiliation. And you can take people's money, you can arrest them, but when they feel humiliated, that's when they will do truly aberrant things. It's true in this country, okay, and it's true in every civilization that I know. And when you have many, many young men who are humiliated, and you combine that also with a sexually repressed situation of young men who can't get married, they can't get jobs, they can't have wives, they've never held a girl's hand. That is a dynamite combination.
The youth bulge is what I call that. Duh. Pun intended.
Let me start with the question that Ruzbe and Faraj asked in different ways. This may surprise you because you both were saying, why doesn't the U.S. do more to change its habit of dealing with authoritarian regimes in this part of the world? If you look back at the last 10, 12 years, you could argue the U.S. has done too much, too aggressively to try to break with its relationships with these authoritarian rulers. I mean, the invasion of Iraq to depose Saddam Hussein, the ultimate authoritarian ruler, when you strip away all the reasons for it, I think had a core of a kind of, misplaced idealism about what a democratic Iraq would do for the region. You know, people were looking at 9/11, this catastrophic event for the United States. Why did they hate us? Why are we caught in this nightmare? And people were trying to think strategically, and they said, if we knock the tallest tent pole in this intolerant Arab world out by overthrowing Saddam and let democracy, let this rising Shia class that embodies the democratic idea, we'll have a new world. They believe that. Condi Rice and others would troop through Egypt and infuriate Mubarak, lecturing about democracy. And then Obama made what, less belligerent than Bush, but made what I've called a cosmic wager on Islamic democracy. If you ask any ordinary Egyptian, they'll say America backed Morsi. And they're still furious about it because Egyptians, as Tom said, feel that Morsi basically was intolerant, arrogant. I've traveled a lot in the countryside in Egypt. There was a popular rising against Morsi. So the idea that we've made a terrible mistake, in the elections in the West Bank, Israelis said, gee, should we really have elections? I mean, Hamas might get elected. And we insisted, yes, you have to have elections. We weren't prepared for the consequences because we immediately tried to delegitimize the elected government. But I must say, Hamas's record does not encourage me to think well of Islamic democracy. And, the final piece of this strategy for our current president was his embrace of Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, who was the president's best friend, and, he was going to help us reshape the modern Middle East. And the whole point was he was basically a proto-Muslim Brotherhood figure, was seen as that by the White House. And that was how we were going to go. Just as we embraced the Christian Democrats in Europe and won the Cold War, we were going to embrace the Muslim Democrats. That strategy has not been successful. I'll just say it. It has not succeeded. So you have a president, and I think generally you have a foreign policy elite that says, we're going to have to get a lot less starry-eyed about whatever we do. The age of idealism, and Tom has expressed this by saying basically we need to be humble. The age of idealism is over. And, people will find their way to their own systems of governance that are stable, but I think there's going to be less American enthusiasm about democracy. Just briefly to Nazila's question about radicalization. There's some wonderful studies that have been done by American academics, some of whom have worked very usefully for the U.S. government, who populate places like the National Center for Counterterrorism, looking at what happens that moves people from being more and more religious, going to the mosque, sitting with a sheikh, sitting after prayers with their friends, to being jihadists. How does that happen? And the models are interesting, and they're not very different from models of any other cult that succeeds in drawing people into extreme action. There's a life crisis for the person. This group speaks to the stressed person in the life crisis, and then suddenly they are in a different space. And you can see this with many different religions. It's useful to take the Islamic piece out because you can see it with Christians, you can see it with the key, everybody has concluded who looks at this, is having people who are prepared to intervene, who see that young man as he's beginning to veer towards this extreme bond with crazy people who are going to send him to Syria. And, the FBI works really hard to have structures like this. British MI5, they're pulling their hair out. I mean, if you were in London right now, you'd hear people who are really anxious about their homegrown problem. I just have been talking with the French, who are pretty good at this, but they're also just so. I think this is, it's an issue for cops, not journalists, but it's a huge issue.
So Tom has to catch a flight at 1:30. That means we have time for two very concise final questions. I'm so sorry. There's so many of you. Kamran's had his hand up for a long time. If you can be very concise, please.
Hi, I'm Cameron Lahi, and I come from Silicon Valley, so my question might be too idealistic. But Tom, I guess I would like you to address as a hope and rebuilding and providing something. Should we say the road to peace instead of Jerusalem or Baghdad is Silicon Valley, to really bring the high-tech entrepreneurship, especially I'm sure you're aware of the growth of TEDx, startups. I was in Startup Ramallah last November, and 75 companies came with business plans who wanted me to finance them. And in Tehran, if you look at it in the last 2 years, something like 28 different, in Iran, 28 different cities are there. So can you talk about Silicon Valley and the road to peace?
Thank you. And last question, Gary.
Thanks very much to all three of you, by the way. Back to Tom's point about the division between dismantle and defeat, which seems to me to be an enormously important one. What is it that is...
Degrade and defeat.
I'm sorry, degrade and defeat. That what is it? What are the roadblocks today that are preventing the people whose job it is to defeat from taking on that assignment? And is it realistic to assume that that's going to happen anytime soon? And the flip side of that, it seems to me, is do you get the sense that the American foreign policy elite understands that our job is the first part and not the second part?
I'll start there and go to the first question. I don't know about the foreign policy elite, but I can assure you, and David really laid this out, that the President of the United States does. He is the reluctant warrior David talked about, because as a warrior, he thinks ISIS is truly a sick, demented movement that doesn't threaten the American homeland today, but it certainly threatens the islands of decency in that part of the world, and if allowed to metastasize, would really damage our interests and simply hurt many, many Arabs, Muslims, Iranians, etc. And therefore, I don't buy the argument, well, let's just do nothing and let it sort out. But at the same time, he understands that a movement like that can only be defeated. The two most important words in foreign policy are self and sustaining. There's no movement, we proved this time and again, there's no country we can't defeat, no terrorist group we can't wipe out, but all important politics in the Middle East, I'm sure everywhere else, happens the morning after the morning after. So the morning after, once you're Israel and you've bashed up Hamas, once you're America and you've defeated, Saddam, once you're NATO and you've knocked out Gaddafi, who is going to run the place in a self-sustaining way on the basis of more decent values the morning after the morning after? And if you don't have a question to that, if you don't have an answer to that question, either don't start or really limit your objectives. And what Obama has decided to do is that he can't afford not to start, so he's really limiting the objectives. I'm going to try to contain this thing, radiate the tumor as much as we can, shrink it, but it can only be defeated on a foundation of trust, which is how you get a government based on citizenship. So if the Ignatiuses are ruling, the Friedmans don't feel they have to leave the country. And if the Friedmans are ruling, the Ignatiuses don't feel like they have to leave the country. Look, what's going on? We have a pluralistic region with no pluralism. Okay? So when you have a pluralistic region with no pluralism, its pluralistic nature can only be managed vertically by an iron fist from the top down. Ottomans did that for 500 years, and the British and French did it. Then we had kings and dictators to do it. The moment we are in now is that there's no more Ottomans, no more British and French. Nobody wants to be an imperialist. We all understand now all you win is a bill. And no more kings and dictators, or very few left. So this pluralistic region without pluralism can no longer be managed vertically from the top down. It actually can only be managed in a decent way horizontally by the constituent communities forging social contracts for how to live together equally as citizens, not as Shiites, Sunnis, etc. So you're seeing the real story is you're seeing a giant region go from vertical to horizontal. Now, you can only do that if you have one of three things. If you have a Mandela. Oh, man. South Africa had a Mandela. What the Middle East could use, for a Mandela. But it turns out there was only one, and he just passed away. Second, if you have a military, a far-sighted military. Egypt has a military. It's managing that move, but not, in my view, in a far-sighted way. And the third is if you have a midwife. That was the role we played, or tried to play in Iraq, most inexpertly. But if you're going from vertical to horizontal, and you have no Mandela, no military, and no midwife, you have Syria and the chaos in Iraq today. That's what you're seeing. Now, we forget, because we take it so for granted, and when you only look around this room, and I always like to remind people of this, what freaks we are. We are freaks. We have twice elected a black man whose middle name is Hussein, whose grandfather was a Muslim, who defeated a woman to run against a Mormon. Who the fuck does that, okay? All right? So, we are freaks. And we only need to look at the news from Ferguson to know that we are a work in progress. It took us 250 years just to get there, and we are a work in progress every day. And so to me, the great challenge out there is how do you bring pluralism to a pluralistic region without all these other crutches, And maybe people just really need to hit bottom. Just really crash and burn on the bottom. To say this Sunni Shiite thing, I think I can speak for David. When we were in Beirut in the 80s, I didn't even know who was a Sunni, who was a Shiite. I mean, I knew vaguely, you know what I mean? But most of our friends in West Beirut, maybe we were living in a bubble, were really intermarried and whatnot. And I'm sure we were living in somewhat of a bubble. But it wasn't like it was today. And that gets to your question. What's your first name again? I'm sorry. Cameron. Silicon Valley works on one foundation, and it's actually trust. There is no innovation without trust, because trust is like a hard floor. Because without trust, there's no collaboration, and since all of us are smarter than one of us, without trust, there can be no innovation. You can do it in small pockets, in Ramallah, in a neighborhood of Tehran or whatever, but an innovation-based economy absolutely is founded on trust. When there's trust in the room, good things happen. And when there is no trust in the room, you cannot invent a light bulb.
Well, I tend to disagree with you, but we cannot.
Okay.
David, you have the final word.
I'll just be brief. I think that entrepreneurship is something that the Arab Muslim world has profoundly. I mean, there aren't more entrepreneurial people that I know than Iranians, Egyptians across the region. Whenever I'm really feeling depressed in my travels in the region, I stop off in Cairo to see my friend Ahmed Elfi, who runs something called Flat 6 Labs, which is an incubation lab for young entrepreneurs. They're coming out not of Stanford or GW. They're coming out of Cairo University typically. They're kids. They're not from fancy families. They've got good ideas. They're building simple apps, and Elfi helps them get their businesses going. He's had an amazing success record. He's starting similar incubation labs other places in the Middle East. When I was flying into Tehran in December, I happened to sit down next to a gentleman who was wearing a New York Mets baseball cap. So I said, "Oh, are you from New York?" And he said, "No, I just like the Mets." So he was an Iranian. He was an Iranian scientist doing, I fear identifying him, so I'll just say a very advanced kind of molecular biochemistry with a world-class idea that he was trying to build out. And getting capital to make that idea into a product, because he doesn't want to leave Tehran. He said, offers, do this in India, do this in Switzerland, do this. He wants to, he loves Iran. And his dilemma of how to be a brilliant world-class scientist and stay in Iran is what's going to change that country. So I couldn't agree more with that. I could talk about Gary's question about the Obama policy, where I think Tom expressed it well. I'll just close by saying there's so many times when I think this president and recent American presidents have gotten it wrong, and I walk away from the White House shaking my head, thinking, "Here we go." And just I think Tom and I both felt that we were listening to a president who has really been beaten up, sometimes quite properly, who's got a better fix on what he ought to do and how to do it in a way that doesn't make the region worse, and brings good people to the fore and says, you have to do this. Using Tom's basic concept, you have to do this. We can't do it, and we're not going to do it. So you have to step up. I think that's the core of the policy the president announced Wednesday, and thank goodness it's a good core.
Well put. Well, some of you know that David is of Armenian heritage, or partially Armenian heritage, and Tom, of course, mentioned his Jewish heritage. So I think one of the things we did today was cement this ancient bond between the Persians, the Armenians, and the Jews. So thank you so much.